Vance arrived at the sprawling expanse of Fort Bragg under a bleached white sky that offered no relief from the North Carolina humidity. She moved with a quiet economy that rendered her almost invisible, a woman who had mastered the art of taking up less space than she was entitled to. Her credentials, stamped on a flimsy temporary badge clipped to her plain gray shirt, identified her as a civilian firearms maintenance specialist. Her attire was as unassuming as her title. Worn, functional work pants, scuffed boots, and dark hair pulled back in a severe, no-nonsense bun. She carried a heavy, olive-drab toolkit that looked as if it had survived several wars, its steel corners rounded smooth by time and use. The two young guards at the main gate, crisp and polished in their uniforms, scanned her paperwork with a bored indifference reserved for contractors and delivery drivers. They waved her through without a second glance, their eyes already seeking the next vehicle, the next uniform, the next person of importance. She walked through the heart of the base, a ghost moving through a city of ghosts. Here, the phantoms wore uniforms and marched with rigid purpose. The air thrummed with the cadence of platoon runs, the distant thud of artillery practice, and the sharp, punctuating bark of drill sergeants. Salutes were exchanged like currency, each movement precise, a tiny, ingrained ritual of respect and hierarchy. Alara observed it all with a detached stillness, her gaze sweeping over the manicured lawns and the severe brick buildings. It was a world she knew intimately, yet one from which she was now profoundly disconnected. It was a place of straight lines and clear orders, and she had come from the shadows that existed between those lines. Her destination was the base armory, a low, windowless building that smelled of gun oil, solvent, and worn steel. Inside, the air was cool and filled with the metallic chatter of men at work. Master Sergeant Riggs, a man whose formidable gut was constrained by a uniform stretched to its limits, took her paperwork. He held it at arm's length, his brow furrowed in a deep, skeptical frown as he read. Civilian attachment, he grumbled, more to himself than to her. For the Special Forces qualification range? When the hell for? He looked up at Alara, his eyes giving her a quick, dismissive appraisal. He saw a plain, middle-aged woman with tired eyes and rough-looking hands. He saw a problem, an anomaly in his well-ordered world. "We have the best armorers in the Army right here, ma'am." The ma'am was not a sign of respect, but a barrier. He gestured vaguely toward a corner of the workshop, a space already cluttered with discarded parts bins and forgotten equipment. "Right, you can set up over there. Stay out of the way of my guys. They're prepping for General Thorne's inspection." Several of the younger armorers, lean and cocky soldiers in their early 20s, glanced over. They saw what Riggs saw, a nonentity. A few of them shared a smirk before turning back to the sleek, modular rifles on their benches, the high-speed tools of the modern warrior. Alara said nothing. She simply picked up her heavy toolkit, walked to the dusty corner, and set it down with a soft, solid thud. She pulled over a rickety stool and began to methodically unpack her own tools, each one worn smooth with years of use, and arranged them on a clean rag she laid over the grimy workbench. She was a stone dropped into a river, and the currents of the armory simply flowed around her, undisturbed. General Marcus Thorne moved through the armory like a storm front, his presence sucking the air from the room and replacing it with a palpable tension. He was a man carved from the granite of military tradition, his uniform immaculate, his posture a testament to a lifetime of discipline. His entourage of aides and officers trailed in his wake, scribbling notes and murmuring deferentially. Thorne's inspections were legendary for their brutal thoroughness. He missed nothing, and he forgave less. His gaze swept across the rows of impeccably maintained rifles, the neatly organized parts drawers, and the focused work of the armorers. It was a machine of which he was proud. Then his eyes landed on the anomaly in the corner. He saw Alara, her back to the room, hunched over a weapon that seemed anachronistic in this temple of modern warfare. It was an M14, its wooden stock dark and oiled, its steel parkerized to a soft gray. An antique. He strode over, his polished boots echoing on the concrete floor. The other armorers froze, their hands stilling above their work. Master Sergeant Riggs's face went pale. Riggs, the general's voice was a low baritone that could cut through battlefield noise. Who is this? Riggs hurried over, his heart pounding. Civilian specialist, sir. Attached from Logistics Command. Firearms maintenance. Thorne's lips thinned into a line of pure condescension. A specialist? In what exactly? Dusting museum pieces. He looked from Riggs to Alara's back, his disdain radiating in waves. She didn't turn around, her hands still moving with slow, deliberate care as she seated a spring into the rifle's trigger assembly. Her focus was absolute, as if the four-star general behind her was nothing more than a minor atmospheric disturbance. This blatant lack of deference finally made Thorne address her directly. "Ma'am," he said, the word heavy with sarcasm. "This is a high-readiness facility. We're training the tip of the spear. We don't have the time or the space for hobbyists." He gestured grandly toward a rack of state-of-the-art SCAR-H rifles, gleaming with optics and lasers. "This is the future of warfare. That," he pointed a contemptuous finger at the M14 on her bench, "is a relic. It belongs on a VFW hall wall, not in my armory." Alara finally finished her task and gently placed the tool back on the rack. She still didn't turn. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable for everyone but her and the general. Thorne, accustomed to immediate and absolute obedience, was clearly irritated. He let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound devoid of humor. He turned to his primary aide, a young, eager colonel. "First they cut our budgets. Now they send us librarians to teach urban combat. What's next?" His laugh echoed in the cavernous space as he turned to continue his inspection, dismissing her completely. The armorers visibly relaxed, some hiding smiles. Alara remained still for a moment, listening to the general's laughter fade down the long corridor. Then, she picked up the M14's bolt and began to clean it, her expression as placid and unreadable as deep water. In the days that followed, Alara became part of the armory's background noise. She claimed her dusty corner as her own quiet kingdom, arriving before anyone else and leaving long after the final bell. She spoke little, and when she did, her words were brief and functional. "Pass the solvent. Needs a new gas ring. Check the headspace." Most of her time was spent with the forgotten weapons, the ones the younger armorers deemed obsolete. She took apart old Beretta M9 pistols, honing their trigger pulls until they broke like glass. She restored a Remington 870 shotgun that had been slated for scrap, its action now impossibly smooth. And always, she returned to the M14, tuning it with the loving patience of a watchmaker. Her hands, which at first glance seemed merely rough, moved with a surgical grace and economy of motion that was almost hypnotic. She knew the language of steel, the subtle dialects of wear patterns and stress fractures. From her corner, she observed. She watched the elite Special Forces candidates come and go, retrieving their weapons for range time. She saw more than they knew. She saw the infinitesimal hesitation in a young lieutenant's target acquisition, a product of over-reliance on a red dot sight. She saw the wasted half-second in a sergeant's reload, a clumsy can of the wrist that could be fatal. She saw how they held their rifles like tools, not like extensions of their own bodies. They were skilled, strong, and brave, but they were products of a system that prized technology over instinct. She could see the failures in their equipment before they happened, diagnosing a loose gas key from the faint carbon trace on a bolt carrier, or predicting a feeding malfunction from the angle of a magazine spring. She would quietly fix the issues before returning the weapon, never mentioning the near failure she had averted. A young corporal named Diaz was the first to look past the simple woman and see the artist. Diaz was quiet himself, a third-generation soldier with an old soul. He noticed that Alara's workbench, unlike the others, was never messy. Her tools were laid out in a precise order. Her movements were fluid and certain. He watched her work on the M14 and felt a strange sense of reverence. One afternoon, he gathered his courage and approached her. "That's an old rifle, ma'am," he began, his voice soft. Alara glanced up, her eyes assessing him for a moment before she gave a slight nod. "It's reliable," she said, her voice a low murmur. As she reached for a small file, her watch strap slid up her wrist, revealing a detail Diaz had only glimpsed before. It was a tattoo, stark against her skin. A single, five-pointed star, faded to a bluish gray. It was crudely done, almost like a prison tattoo, yet the points of the star were perfectly, geometrically precise. It seemed a contradiction, a piece of brutalist art. Diaz wanted to ask about it, but the look in her eyes, a deep, ancient weariness, stopped him. He just nodded and retreated. The image of a star burned into his mind. He had the unsettling feeling that the simple mechanic in the corner knew more about the rifles they carried, and the places they were meant to be used, than anyone on the entire base. Pressure arrived on a Tuesday, disguised as a high-stakes training exercise. General Thorne had orchestrated a final validation for the top SF candidate team, a complex hostage rescue scenario inside the base's sophisticated kill house from a darkened, air-conditioned control booth high above the range. Thorne and his staff observed the action on a bank of monitors, every angle covered, every sound amplified. The team was led by Lieutenant Greaves, a young officer whose confidence bordered on arrogance. He and his men were the best of the best, equipped with the latest technology money could buy. Alara was in the control room, a silent presence in the back. She had just delivered a set of sidearms she had personally calibrated. Her reason for being there tenuous but tolerated by Riggs, who was sweating under the general's watchful eye. Greaves's team breached the first door with explosive force. They moved fast, their movements honed by weeks of practice. But to Alara's discerning eye, they were loud. Their gear rattled. Their footsteps were heavy. They communicated in clipped, professional barks, but they weren't listening to the silence in between. As they entered the central chamber of the simulated building, the scenario's architect threw a wrench in the works. On Thorne's order, the operator at the console initiated a system-wide failure. The team's helmet-integrated comms crackled and died. Simultaneously, their advanced holographic sights glitched, projecting multiple, overlapping red dots, ghost targets shimmering in the dusty air. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The team, stripped of the digital certainties they had been trained to rely on, faltered. Their forward momentum ceased. Confusion turned to hesitation, hesitation to near panic. They began engaging the phantom dots, wasting ammunition on empty walls. Their discipline, so impressive moments before, evaporated under the invisible pressure of uncertainty. Two men nearly fired on each other in the confusion. From the control booth, Thorne watched, his face a mask of cold fury. The exercise wasn't just a failure, it was an indictment. "Get them out of there," he barked into his microphone, his voice tight with rage. Mission failure. Complete and utter failure. He slammed his fist on the console, the sound cracking through the grim silence of the room. He turned to his staff, his eyes blazing. "Is this what we're sending into the fight? Men who can't see without a battery?" Alara stood in the back, her face impassive, her gaze fixed on the screen showing the team's disorganized retreat. She had seen this before. The atmosphere in the control room was thick with recrimination. General Thorne paced like a caged tiger. $2 million of simulated chaos, and they fold like a cheap suit, he roared, gesturing at the screens. "We've made them weaker. We've trained the instinct right out of them." His officers stood silent, avoiding his gaze. The next team was scheduled to run the course, but their faces, visible on a prep room camera, were pale with apprehension. They had just witnessed the public humiliation of their peers. It was Master Sergeant Riggs who, in a desperate attempt to deflect the general's wrath, threw Alara into the fire. "Sir," he began, his voice shaky, "that new civilian specialist, Vance, she works on the older systems. She's good with electronics. Maybe she can see what went wrong with the optics." It was a wild guess, a Hail Mary pass born of fear. Thorne stopped pacing and glared at Riggs, then let his eyes drift to the back of the room where Alara stood. He scoffed, the sound dripping with derision. But he was out of immediate options, and his fury demanded an object. "Fine," he snapped. "Let the librarian have a look. Can't make it any worse. The invitation was an insult, a way to prove a point about the uselessness of outsiders. Alara moved from the shadows, walking toward the main engineering console with her steady, unhurried gait. The lead systems engineer, a man with multiple degrees, looked at her with open hostility as she approached the station. She ignored him. She also ignored the complex diagnostic software he had been fruitlessly running. Instead, she asked for the full sensor playback of the run. She watched it once, her eyes scanning not the technical readouts, but the human element, the soldiers' movements, their posture, the can of their heads. After a full minute of intense silence, she spoke. Her voice was low and calm, yet it cut through the tension in the room. They didn't fail because the system glitched, she stated, not looking at the general. They failed because they can't function without the system. Their eyes are trained to follow the red dot, not to scan the space behind it. The glitch didn't cause the failure. It only revealed it. She then lifted a hand and pointed to a secondary monitor displaying the facility's power grid schematics, a screen no one else had been watching. Her finger rested on a tiny, almost imperceptible flicker in the wave pattern of the power conduit feeding the range. "And that's the source of your glitch," she said simply. "A microfluctuation in the power relay. It's a hardware issue, not software." A stunned silence fell over the room. The engineers, who had been searching for a corrupted line of code for the past hour, scrambled to check the relay. A moment later, one of them looked up, his face a mixture of shock and embarrassment. "She's right, sir. The relay is faulty." The revelation hung in the air, thick and uncomfortable. The engineers were humbled. The officers were intrigued. General Thorne stared at Alara, his expression shifting from open derision to a grudging, confused reassessment. He had dismissed her as a hobbyist, a relic, but she had just diagnosed a complex technical problem in 30 seconds by using pure observation, a problem his own highly paid experts had missed. Still, he was not a man who yielded easily. "So you can read a schematic," he said, his tone still challenging, a final bastion of his authority. "A lucky guess. What about your other theory? The one about my men being too reliant on their gear?" He was daring her, testing to see if her insight was a fluke. Alara didn't deign to answer him with words. Her gaze shifted to the monitor showing the next team, their anxiety palpable even on the grainy screen. She turned to Master Sergeant Riggs, her voice still quiet but now imbued with a new authority. "Permission to adjust their slings, Master Sergeant." Riggs was flabbergasted. He looked to the general for guidance, his mouth slightly agape. Thorne hesitated for only a second. His curiosity had finally outweighed his skepticism. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. "Do it," he commanded. Alara walked out of the control booth and down the concrete steps to the staging area. The 4 soldiers of the next team watched her approach, their expressions wary. She didn't offer a greeting or an explanation. She moved from man to man, her hands working with deft, certain movements. She adjusted the nylon sling on each soldier's rifle, tightening it here, looping it there, subtly changing the way the weapon hung against their bodies. The adjustments were minute, almost invisible, but they fundamentally altered the rifle's center of balance and how it felt to the user. Lieutenant Greaves, the officer from the failed team, was watching from the sidelines, his arms crossed in a defensive posture. As Alara adjusted the last sling, he stepped forward. "My men have their setups configured for optimal performance," he said stiffly, the protest a defense of his own wounded pride. Alara stopped her work and simply looked at him. She said nothing. Her gaze was not hostile or challenging. It was steady, deep, and utterly unflinching. Under the weight of that silent gaze, Greaves's bravado crumbled. He swallowed, looked away, and fell silent. Corporal Diaz, who had been observing the entire exchange with rapt fascination, felt a thrill of recognition. The way she wrapped the sling, a specific, unconventional loop around the stock and forend, was not random. He leaned over to the soldier next to him and whispered, his voice full of awe, "That's the Spectre wrap. My grandfather told me about it. From his time in the service. He said only the ghost units used it." said it made the rifle a part of you. The name, a whisper of special operations folklore, hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Spectre. General Thorne, now thoroughly intrigued, watched from the booth as Alara finished her adjustments and walked back off the range floor. He leaned into his microphone. "All right, let's run it again," he commanded. "But this time, kill the optics entirely. Iron sights only. No combs. Let's see how they do with the basics," he added, casting a pointed glance in Alara's direction as she re-entered the control room. Down on the floor, the team looked at their now powerless rifles with dread. Their multi-thousand-dollar sights were just dead weight. Alara stepped to the railing overlooking the team. For the first time, she addressed them directly, her voice carrying an authority that belied her civilian clothes. "Forget the room," she said, her tone low and resonant. "See the doorways. Forget the target. See the threat behind it. Move to the sound of your partner's breathing. Your weapon is not a tool. It's your point of focus. Now go." They entered the kill house. The transformation was immediate and profound. The sling adjustments she had made forced them into a more aggressive, instinctive posture, pulling the rifle tight into their shoulder pocket. They moved slower than Greaves's team had, but with a fluid, predatory grace. Without comms, they relied on peripheral vision and sound. Moving in concert, their footsteps soft, their awareness heightened. Without glowing dots to chase, their eyes scanned the whole environment, processing threats with primal clarity. Their shots were deliberate, each one a conscious decision. They cleared room after room, flawlessly neutralizing targets, their movements a textbook example of fire and maneuver. In the control room, the staff watched in stunned silence. This was the skill, the instinct they had been trying and failing to teach for months. Thorne stood with his arms crossed, his face an unreadable mask, but his eyes were locked on the screens. He saw the art in their violence, the deadly dance she had choreographed with a few inches of nylon webbing. He decided to push it further. "Range master," he ordered, "put a new target in the final room. Impossible shot. Hostage directly in front of a hostile. Only a partial sliver of the hostile visible from one angle, and it's partially obscured by a simulated wall." The operator complied, a new target popping into place. On the floor, the team leader entered the room, saw the setup, and immediately froze. "It's a no-shoot, sir," he said aloud to no one. "I can't take the shot. I'll hit the hostage." Thorne looked away from the monitor and directly at Alara. "What now, specialist?" he asked, the question holding the weight of his entire worldview. "What does your instinct say about that?" Alara didn't answer. She turned and walked to the corner of the range floor where a gun rack stood. She picked up the old, heavy M14 she had been so carefully tending to, its oiled wood warm in her hands. She chambered around with a smooth, solid clack and walked toward the entrance of the kill house. Every eye in the control booth, and every eye on the range, was on Alara as she stepped into the dimly lit kill house. The monitors followed her alone, gray-shirt figure moving with lethal purpose through the plywood maze. She reached the final room, the one with the impossible shot. She didn't raise the rifle. Instead, she stood perfectly still for a long moment, her head tilted as if listening to something no one else could hear. She was calculating angles, density, velocity. She closed her eyes for a single, brief second. Then she moved, dropping not to a standard firing kneel, but into a low, coiled crouch that seemed to defy skeletal mechanics. It was an ugly, unnatural posture, but it was perfectly stable. She raised the M14. The heavy rifle, which looked cumbersome on others, seemed weightless in her hands, a seamless extension of her will. She didn't seem to aim so much as simply point. There was a single, deafening crack. The 308 round tore through the thin sheetrock of the simulated wall at a precise point she had chosen. It struck a concealed steel support beam, a detail she could only have intuited, and ricocheted. The deflected bullet changed trajectory perfectly, entering the target zone from the side, passing through the sliver of space between the hostage and the wall, and striking the hostile target squarely in the head. A perfect shot, a mathematically impossible shot. In the control booth, There was a collective, sharp intake of breath. General Thorne stood as if turned to stone, his mouth slightly open. His aide, a bright young major named Kensington, had been furiously tapping on a secured tablet ever since Alara had identified the power relay issue. He had used his clearance to pull her file, or what was left of it. Most of it was redacted, solid blocks of black ink hiding a secret history. But his clearance was high enough to see one or two unredacted fragments. At the bottom of a commendation summary for a mission that was itself classified was a single word, a call sign. His face went bone white. He leaned toward the general, his voice a choked whisper. "Sir." "General Thorne." "Sir." Thorne didn't take his eyes off the screen. "What is it, Major?" "Her file, sir. Her name isn't just Vance. Her full service name is Alara Vance. Her designation. They called her Spectre." The name landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow. Kensington swallowed hard, his voice trembling. "She wasn't just in a ghost unit, sir. She led one. The file's almost entirely gone, but she was the commander of Task Force Nightfall. The one from the Herat Province incident. The records we aren't allowed to read." Corporal Diaz, standing near the back of the booth to retrieve a tool, overheard the major's hushed words. The legend of Spectre was a barracks myth, a ghost story told by old-timers, a near-supernatural operator who could walk through walls and make impossible shots. And the star on her wrist. It wasn't a crude tattoo. It was a memorial, one for each member of her original team, lost on a mission no one was allowed to talk about. The quiet mechanic was a living legend. Alara emerged from the kill house, the smoke from the M14's muzzle still curling in the air. She moved to the gun rack and gently placed the rifle back in its cradle, her movements as careful and respectful as if she were laying a comrade to rest. She didn't look towards the control booth or acknowledge the dozens of eyes that were now fixed on her, burning with a new, profound understanding. She simply turned and began to walk back toward the armory, back to her dusty corner, her job apparently done. As she moved, a remarkable thing happened. The soldiers, the candidates, the instructors, the range masters, all of them instinctively stepped aside. They parted for her, creating a wide, silent corridor. Their expressions were a complex tapestry of awe, shame, and sheer reverence. Lieutenant Greaves, the officer whose arrogance she had so quietly dismantled, stood ramrod straight as she passed, his eyes locked forward in a posture of rigid respect. Corporal Diaz, his heart hammering in his chest, snapped to attention and rendered the sharpest, most heartfelt salute of his young career. Alara didn't stop walking. She didn't break her stride, but as she passed Diaz, she gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod of acknowledgement. It was more than enough. As she neared the walkway leading to the control booth, the door swung open. General Marcus Thorne stepped out, blocking her path. He stood directly in front of her, forcing her to stop. For a long moment, they just stood there, the four-star general and the anonymous woman in the gray shirt. He didn't speak. His eyes, which had once held such easy derision, were now filled with a depth of emotion she understood all too well: regret, humility, and an overwhelming, unspoken respect. He saw her now, truly saw her, not the hobbyist but the warrior. He saw the history etched in the tired lines around her eyes and the quiet strength in her steady hands. Then, with a slowness and precision that spoke volumes, General Thorne raised his right hand to the brim of his hat. He rendered a slow, formal salute. It was not the crisp, automatic gesture he gave his subordinates. It was a deliberate, reverent act, a silent apology, and a profound tribute from one soldier to another. He held it, his posture unyielding, a statue of recognition. Alara held his gaze for a beat longer. For the first time, an emotion flickered across her stoic face. Not triumph, not pride, but a deep, weary acceptance. She gave a single, curt nod, acknowledging the gesture and all it represented. Then, she stepped around him and continued on her way. She did not return to the workbench that had been her sanctuary. Her presence at Fort Bragg had never been about maintenance. It was a quiet favor, a call to an old friend still high in the command structure. A man who suspected his premier training program was producing flawed soldiers and needed an outside eye to confirm it. He needed an audit that would never be filed, conducted by an expert who officially no longer existed. Her work was done. She packed her few personal belongings into a small duffel bag and picked up her heavy, olive-drab toolkit. As she walked toward the main gate, the setting sun casting her long shadow behind her, she heard hurried footsteps. Master Sergeant Riggs, his face flushed and his chest heaving, caught up to her. "Ma'am," he panted, his voice now stripped of all its former arrogance. "Ma'am Vance." "The general. He wanted me to ask. He wanted to know if you would consider a permanent position. Chief instructor for the entire qualification course." Alara paused and looked back across the base. She saw the sprawling ranges, the severe brick buildings, the young soldiers who were even now practicing the sling rap she had shown them. She thought of the noise, the bureaucracy, the endless meetings and political battles. She thought of the life she had left behind and the quiet peace she had fought so hard to find. She turned back to Riggs and gave a small, sad shake of her head. "I'm just a mechanic," she said. The words held no trace of irony, only the simple, unadorned truth of who she chose to be now. She turned and continued her walk toward the gate, leaving Riggs standing in the fading light. The last thing Corporal Diaz saw of her was a solitary silhouette moving away from the world that had once defined her, a world that had, for one brief, astonishing day, remembered her name. Back in the armory, her workbench was clean and empty, save for one object left dead center on the rack. It was a single, gleaming brass casing, ejected from the M14 she had fired. It sat there, a small, silent monument to the day the easy laughter on the range had faded into a reverent hush. It was a testament to the ghost who had walked among them, reminding them all that the deadliest weapon isn't the rifle, but the quiet, unassuming mind that guides it. The low, steady hum of the perfectly tuned machinery seemed to fill the void she left, a quiet legacy of her brief, powerful passage.